Imagine you're leader of a major European nation in September 1938. You receive a phone call that changes everything. Adolf Hitler is threatening to invade Czechoslovakia. He's demanding the Sudetenland, a region on the German-Czechoslovak border with approximately 3 million ethnic German speakers. He's given an ultimatum. Hand it over by October 1st, or he will launch a military invasion. Thousands will die. The war will begin. You have the military power to stop him. You have the resources. You have the advantage. Your generals have told you clearly, we can defeat Germany if we act now. This is our moment. This is when we can stop him before he becomes too powerful. But you're afraid. You're exhausted. You lost millions of soldiers in World War I just 20 years ago. Your country still bears the psychological and economic scars of that catastrophe. Your people don't want another war. They're traumatized by the memory of the trenches, the mud, the endless killing. Your economy is still recovering from the Great Depression, and this man, Hitler, he keeps saying he just wants peace. He keeps saying he just wants what's rightfully German. He keeps saying the Sudetenland is the last territorial demand he'll make. So what do? Do you fight? Do you risk millions of lives? Do you plunge your nation back into war? Or do you compromise? Do you give him what he wants in the hope that it will satisfy him and preserve peace? Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, made a choice. And that choice changed the course of human history. That choice led directly to World War II. That choice resulted in the deaths of 70 million people. Welcome back to Red Tape Tales. I'm your host, and today we're exploring one of the most infamous diplomatic decisions in human history, the Munich Agreement. This is the story of appeasement, the policy of giving a dictator what he wants in hopes he'll be satisfied. This is the story of how the leaders of Europe handed an entire democratic nation to a fascist dictator and called it peace. This is the story of betrayal on a continental scale, of cowardice dressed up as diplomacy, of catastrophic miscalculation that echoed through the decades. And it all started with a lie.
To understand the Munich Agreement, we need to understand what came before it. We need to understand the psychology of appeasement and why intelligent, educated leaders believed it could work. By September 1938, Adolf Hitler had already gotten away with an extraordinary amount of aggressive action. He'd rearmed Germany in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. He built an air force, created a massive army, manufactured tanks and submarines, all forbidden by the treaty. And when he announced this rearmament publicly in 1935, Britain and France complained but took no action. They protested, they issued statements, they expressed their displeasure, and then they accepted it. In 1936, Hitler marched German troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone that was supposed to be a buffer between Germany and France. The Treaty of Versailles explicitly forbade German military presence in the Rhineland. It was a direct violation. And this time, Hitler knew he was taking a massive risk. His generals told him, if France attacks now, we will lose. Our military is not ready. We cannot defeat the French army. We will be defeated and humiliated. But Hitler gambled. He gambled that France and Britain were too afraid to fight. And he was right. France and Britain complained. They protested. They took the matter to the League of Nations. And then they accepted the remilitarization of the Rhineland. Then in March 1938, Hitler annexed Austria. German troops marched into Austria and incorporated it into the German Reich. This was another direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, which explicitly forbade the union of Germany and Austria. This was called the Anschluss. 7 million Austrians became part of Nazi Germany. And again, Britain and France protested, but did nothing. Do you see the pattern? Hitler was testing the waters. He was testing whether the Western powers had the will to stop him. And every single time, he found that they didn't. Every single time, he got away with it. And every single time, he became bolder. So by September 1938, Hitler learned a crucial lesson. But Western powers were afraid. They were traumatized by World War I. They didn't want another war. They would accept almost anything rather than fight. So Hitler decided to push even further. He set his sights on the Sudetenland.
Now, the Sudetenland requires some explanation, because it's not a place most people know about today. The Sudetenland was a region of Czechoslovakia. It was located on the border between Germany and Czechoslovakia. It was a mountainous, heavily fortified region, and it had a large ethnic German population, approximately 3 million people. These ethnic Germans had lived in this region for centuries. After World War I, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up, this region became part of the newly created nation of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was created from the remains of Austria-Hungary, combining Czech, Slovak, and other ethnic groups into a single nation. Now, here's the untold secret that nobody talks about. Hitler's claim that the ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland were being oppressed by the Czech government was a lie. It was propaganda. The ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland weren't being oppressed. They had representation in the Czech government. They had rights. They had schools where they could speak German. They had newspapers in German. They had cultural organizations. In fact, some historians argue they actually had better treatment than ethnic minorities in other countries at that time, including Germany itself. But Hitler didn't care about the truth. He didn't care about the welfare of ethnic Germans. He cared about expansion. He cared about territory. He cared about Lebensraum, living space. He cared about building a greater Germany that would dominate Europe and become a superpower. So, Hitler created a political movement in the Sudetenland. He founded a fascist party called the Sudeten German Party. He had them agitate for union with Germany. He had them organize protests. He had them create the appearance of a mass movement demanding to join Germany. And then he used this manufactured crisis as justification for his demands. Hitler announced, "The ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland want to be part of Germany. They are my people, and I will bring them home to the Reich. If Czechoslovakia refuses to hand over the Sudetenland, I will invade and take it by force." This was the ultimatum. This was the test. Now, Czechoslovakia was a democracy. It had a president, a parliament, a constitution. It was one of the few democracies that existed in Central Europe at that time. It had done nothing wrong. It was being threatened with invasion for no legitimate reason. It was being bullied by a much larger militaristic neighbor. But Czechoslovakia had allies. France had signed a mutual defense treaty with Czechoslovakia. If Germany invaded, France was supposed to come to Czechoslovakia's defense. They were supposed to fight together. And Britain? Britain was the most powerful nation in Europe at that time. If Britain and France stood together and said no, if they told Hitler that invading Czechoslovakia would mean war with both of them, Hitler would have backed down. His own generals told him so. Everyone knew so. This was the moment. This was the critical juncture in history when World War II could have been prevented. If Britain and France had stood firm in September 1938, if they had called Hitler's bluff, if they had said, "We will defend Czechoslovakia," then Hitler would have retreated. Czechoslovakia would have been saved. Nazi Germany would have been stopped in its tracks, and 70 million people would not have died. But they didn't stand firm. Instead, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, decided to do something extraordinary. He decided to fly to Germany to meet with Hitler personally. Think about that for a moment. Neville Chamberlain was in his late 60s.
He had never flown in an airplane before in his entire life. He was old. He was set in his ways. He was a conservative businessman who believed in negotiation and compromise. But he got on an airplane, which was still a relatively dangerous and frightening prospect in 1938, and flew to Germany to meet with a fascist dictator who was threatening to start a war. Why did he do this? Because he believed he could negotiate with Hitler. He believed he could reason with him. He believed he could find a compromise that would satisfy Hitler's demands and preserve peace in Europe. This belief was the fundamental mistake. You cannot negotiate with someone who wants everything. You cannot compromise with someone who sees compromise as weakness. You cannot reason with someone whose ultimate goal is the conquest and domination of Europe. But Chamberlain didn't understand this. He was a businessman. He was used to making deals. He thought diplomacy worked the same way as business deals. He thought if he could just sit down with Hitler and talk, if he could understand Hitler's concerns and Hitler could understand his concerns, they could work something out. They could find a compromise that both sides could accept. This is called the businessman's fallacy. The belief that every conflict can be resolved through negotiation and compromise if both sides are reasonable. But it doesn't work with dictators. It doesn't work with people who don't want to compromise. It doesn't work with people whose goal is total domination. But Chamberlain didn't see it that way. So he flew to Germany. When he arrived, he met with Hitler, and Hitler told him, "I want the Sudetenland. I want it now." And Chamberlain said, "Let me go back and talk to the French and the Czechs about this."
But here's the untold secret that historians have uncovered through documents and diaries. Chamberlain never intended to really negotiate. He'd already decided before he flew to Germany he was going to give Hitler what he wanted. He flew to Germany already knowing he was going to hand over the Sudetenland to Nazi Germany. Why? Why would a British Prime Minister decide to hand over a democratic nation to a fascist dictator? Because Chamberlain was terrified. He was terrified of communism. He was more afraid of Soviet Russia than he was of Nazi Germany. This was the great ideological divide of the 1930s. On one side, you had capitalism and democracy. On the other side, you had communism. And many Western leaders, including Chamberlain, saw Hitler as a potentially useful ally against communism. They thought Hitler is anti-communist. Hitler will stand as a barrier against Soviet expansion. If we allow Germany to become strong, if we allow Hitler to expand, he will be a useful counterweight to the Soviet Union. In other words, they were willing to sacrifice Central Europe to Nazi domination if it meant containing Soviet communism. They thought Hitler could be controlled. They thought if they gave him what he wanted, he would be satisfied and wouldn't threaten Britain or France. This was catastrophically naive, but it drove Chamberlain's entire strategy.
So, Chamberlain went back to London. He met with the French Prime Minister, Edward Daladier. Daladier was nervous. France had a treaty with Czechoslovakia. France was supposed to defend them. But Chamberlain convinced him that fighting was pointless, that Germany was too strong, that they would lose, that the only sensible option was to pressure Czechoslovakia to give up the Sudetenland. And then, and this is crucial, Britain and France, without inviting Czechoslovak representatives to the negotiating table, decided the fate of Czechoslovakia. They decided to hand over the Sudetenland to Hitler. Think about that. The British Prime Minister and the French Prime Minister sat down and decided that an entire region of a democratic nation should be handed to a fascist dictator. And they made this decision without even letting the Czechoslovak government participate in the negotiation. When Czechoslovak representatives asked to attend the negotiations, they were told no. They weren't invited. They weren't consulted. Their fate was being decided without them. And then Chamberlain and Daladier told Czechoslovakia, "You will accept this Munich Agreement. You will hand over the Sudetenland to Hitler. If you refuse, if you try to defend yourselves, we will not help you. You will be on your own. If you fight Germany alone, you will lose, and we will not send troops to help you, so you might as well accept now." So Czechoslovakia, with no allies, with no choice, accepted the Munich Agreement. The Sudetenland was handed to Hitler. Czechoslovakia lost 1/3 of its territory and 1/3 of its population to Nazi Germany.
Now here's the question I want you to think about. How did the leaders of Europe convince themselves that this was peace? Chamberlain flew back to London, he got off the airplane, and he held up a piece of paper. It was the Munich Agreement, signed by Hitler and Chamberlain. And Chamberlain declared to the waiting crowds, "Peace for our time. I have achieved peace." He actually believed it. He actually thought he'd stopped a war by giving Hitler what he wanted. He thought appeasement had worked. The British people cheered. They celebrated. They were so relieved that war had been avoided that they didn't ask the obvious question, at what cost? The cost was an entire nation. The cost was 3 million people handed to Hitler without their consent. The cost was the credibility of international law. The cost was the precedent that you could threaten invasion and get what you wanted. The cost was teaching Hitler that the Western powers would not fight. But the most devastating cost, and this is the key insight, was this. Munich taught Hitler a crucial lesson. It taught him that the Western powers would not fight. It taught him that appeasement worked. It taught him that he could keep pushing, keep expanding, and nobody would stop him. It taught him that Britain and France did not have the will to oppose him. So here's the brain rot question I want you to think about. If Munich taught Hitler that appeasement worked, what would stop him from trying it again? What would prevent him from making another demand? What would prevent him from taking more territory? The answer is nothing. Absolutely nothing.
And that's exactly what happened. Within 6 months of Munich, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. He'd promised Chamberlain. He'd sworn to him. He'd said, "I just want the Sudetenland, just that region. That's all I want. I have no further territorial demands in Europe." He was lying the entire time. In March 1939, German troops marched into Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia. The entire country was absorbed into the German Reich. Czechoslovakia ceased to exist as an independent nation. Chamberlain finally realized he'd been fooled. He finally understood that Hitler couldn't be trusted. He finally understood that you can't negotiate with someone who wants everything. You can't compromise with someone who sees compromise as weakness. But by then, it was too late. The damage was done. The lesson had been learned. Hitler had gotten away with it again. He'd tested the Western powers again, and they'd failed again. And each failure emboldened him more. And now, with Czechoslovakia destroyed, Hitler's next target was obvious: Poland.
But here's another untold secret. Some people at the time knew Munich was a disaster. They knew it was a betrayal. They knew it was a catastrophic mistake that would lead directly to World War II. Winston Churchill was a British politician at the time. He wasn't Prime Minister. Chamberlain was. But Churchill saw what was happening. He understood that Hitler couldn't be stopped by appeasement. He understood that the only way to stop Hitler was to stand up to him militarily.
He understood that compromise with a dictator doesn't lead to peace. It leads to emboldened aggression. Churchill spoke out against Munich. He warned the British people, this is not peace. This is a disaster. This is a total and unmitigated defeat. This is the beginning of the end. You have handed Hitler everything he wants, and now he will want more. But nobody listened. Chamberlain was popular. People wanted to believe that peace had been achieved. They didn't want to hear Churchill's warnings. They didn't want to hear talk of war. So Churchill was sidelined. He was seen as a warmonger. He was criticized for wanting to fight Germany. He was marginalized by his own government. It wasn't until after the war started, after Hitler invaded Poland, after Britain finally declared war, that Churchill became prime minister. It wasn't until Hitler's betrayal became obvious that Churchill's warnings were proven right. Think about that. The person who saw clearly what was happening was ignored. The person who tried to warn everyone was marginalized. And the person who made the catastrophic decision was celebrated. That's how history works sometimes. The truth tellers are ignored until it's too late.
So, what was the Munich Agreement really about? On the surface, it was about the Sudetenland. It was about whether this region of Czechoslovakia would be handed to Germany. But deeper than that, it was about appeasement. It was about the belief that you could satisfy a dictator's demands and achieve peace. It was about the belief that compromise was always better than confrontation. And this belief was catastrophically wrong. Because appeasement doesn't work with dictators. Dictators see appeasement as weakness. They see compromise as surrender. They see each concession as proof that their next demand will also be accepted. So when Chamberlain gave Hitler the Sudetenland, he wasn't achieving peace. He was guaranteeing war. He was buying time, not for himself, but for Hitler to get stronger. But here's the final brain rot question I want you to think about. Did Chamberlain know this? Did he deliberately choose to delay war, knowing that war would eventually come? Some historians argue that Chamberlain was buying time, that Britain needed time to rearm, that by appeasement in 1938, Chamberlain was buying Britain a year to prepare for the war he knew was coming. But other historians argue that Chamberlain genuinely believed appeasement would work, that he thought if he satisfied Hitler's demands, Hitler would be satisfied and wouldn't threaten Britain or France. The truth is probably somewhere in between. But either way, the result was the same. Czechoslovakia was sacrificed, and the world moved closer to war. The Munich Agreement is one of history's most infamous diplomatic moments. It represents the failure of appeasement. It represents the cost of hoping that dictators can be reasoned with. It represents the tragic consequences of choosing peace at any cost. And it teaches us an important lesson. Sometimes standing up to aggression is the only way to prevent war. Sometimes you have to fight to achieve peace. Because Chamberlain thought he could achieve peace through appeasement, but instead he guaranteed war. He delayed it. He pushed it back by a year, but he guaranteed it would come. And when war did come, it was far more devastating than it would have been if the Western powers had stood up to Hitler in 1938. That's the lesson of Munich. That's the lesson of appeasement. And that's why the Munich Agreement represents one of the greatest diplomatic failures in human history. Thank you for listening to Red Tape Tales. Next time, we're exploring the Nazi-Soviet Pact, the shocking alliance between Hitler and Stalin that made World War II inevitable. Until then, keep questioning history, because history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how the decisions we make today can shape the future.